mode.
Hello, welcome to today's webinar called Using Reinforcement Strategies Across All Environments. My name is Laura Ferguson, and I'm with the Kentucky Autism Training Center. Feel free to ask questions or make comments at any point throughout the presentation by typing your question in the question box and clicking send. If you cannot see the question box, click on the orange box with the white arrow in the upper right corner of your screen to open the question box area. I will be answering all questions at the end of the presentation. All right, so today you're going to be with me for an hour and we're going to discuss some reinforcement strategies that you can use in all environments, school, home, and community. So when we're taking a look, what I want you to leave with today is an understanding of those reinforcement strategies, understand how to identify reinforcers for individuals on the autism spectrum, and also to understand how to gradually fade out those reinforcements to look like how you would use them in everyday life and how we use reinforcements in our lives. So hopefully today you'll leave with those three things in mind. So when we start off talking about any of our presentations, we want to first take a look at that autism diagnosis and then go into those strategies of how reinforcement is effective for individuals on the autism spectrum. So we know that with autism, it's a developmental disability that affects areas, and the first area that we see it affects is in the area of social communication. So when we're working with individuals on the autism spectrum, the first thing we're going to see is that they may have a deficit in this area, and under that deficit, we see these three things manifest. And the first one is what we call social emotional reprocessity. And that's where they have trouble with that back and forth conversation. A lot of individuals on the autism spectrum can communicate, but we see sometimes that the issues come when they communicate to their peers, when they talk about things that aren't present, when they're carrying on conversations. So the first thing we see under that social communication deficit is that social emotional reprocessity. The other thing we see is a deficit in what we call nonverbal communicative behaviors. So we see that some individuals with autism have trouble reading nonverbal cues. And then the last thing we see under that social communication is they have trouble developing and maintaining relationships. And if you look at the two above that, if they have trouble with that back and forth conversation, and they may have trouble reading nonverbal cues, we can see how developing and maintaining relationships with their peers and adults could also become a deficit area and an issue for individuals on the spectrum. The second thing we see under the autism spectrum is that we see that they have a restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior. And we have to see two of the following in order to get the diagnosis. And what we may see under that is the first, we may see those stereotyped or repetitive motor movements. So we may see what we call, what we may see is some hand flapping, some rocking. We may see some repetitive speech, repeating things they've heard from movies or sayings they've heard others say throughout the day. We also may see that insistence on sameness, that inflexibility with routines, where they want things to go the same way or things to happen in the same order or putting things in the same order throughout the day. And then we may see that highly restricted or fixated interest. They may have that interest in one thing and they know a lot about it. And the last one we may see under this is that hypo or hyper reactivity to sensory input. And this is where we see kids who have reactions to things in their environment. So when we're looking at the autism diagnosis, why I wanted to go over this real quick before we get into the strategies is that as we're thinking through reinforcement strategies, we're going to think about how we can incorporate this for individuals with autism. So we're going to see that they may have trouble in the areas of social communication, and they're going to have trouble in the areas of repetitive and stereotypical behaviors. So before we get into reinforcement, we always say, and you've probably seen this in a lot of our presentations, if you know one child with autism, you know one child with autism. We like to say that each individual with autism spectrum disorders brings his or her own unique way of interacting with the environment. And each individual brings his or her own reinforcement history. So we'll be talking a lot about that today, looking at reinforcement history, but when we start working with a child, or if you have a child, or if you're working with a child in your classroom, you may see that you don't know the reinforcement history, what behaviors have been reinforced, what behaviors have not been reinforced. So they each bring their own reinforcement history to the plate. And so oftentimes it's very, very important that we understand that reinforcement history and try to either increase it or change it when looking at behaviors that we want to increase or decrease. And that each individual with autism is more like their peers than different. So those are what we talk about at the Autism Center, that when we say that one kid with autism, one kid, because they all are unique, but they all bring that history when we're looking at those behaviors we want to increase and decrease when working with this population. So now we're going to get into what we're all here for today, and that is understanding reinforcement and understanding what is reinforcing to individuals. Because each of you out there in the audience probably has things that are reinforcing to you, and each of those things are different, I would assume. Some of you may really, really like sports, or some of you may really, really like going outside, while others may enjoy computers and programs. So for each of us, we all have things that are reinforcing to us, and each of us are different on what is reinforcing and what kind of changes our behavior. If someone comes into our office or the place that we work or our home and says, oh my goodness, the kitchen looks amazing, or I love the way that you completed that worksheet today, then we may be like, I was reinforced for doing this. This may increase the chance that I'll do this again. So we all bring that reinforcement history, but there are different things that reinforce us as well. So one of the main things we're going to start with and talking about is when we're thinking about reinforcement, we have to think about motivation. And it is very, very important not only for us, but think about it for individuals with autism. We would like to say that, they might be intrinsically motivated to, get out of bed in the morning, or they might really want that A in class, or they may really want items or activities to happen, but sometimes we don't see that. So we have to look at finding that motivation. What can we use to motivate individuals on the autism spectrum? And so taking a look at motivation and trying to understand it, it makes us all different from one another. We are born with those unlearned motivators, such as hunger, thirst, removal of pain, wanting warmth. Those are things that we seek and are unlearned. But when we think about motivators and how they develop, soon individuals develop motivators that are specific to them. I'm an individual who loves sports, and so that was rooted with my parents, and I started to go to sporting events with my parents, and that became something I loved and loved to do. So that motivation became specific to me, but the other individuals I hang out with in my environment don't understand my love of sports. They have other interests with them. So when we see that motivation and we think about those specific motivators, it's very, very important to think about that each individual has their own specific motivators and things that are motivating to them. In a young child, when we're thinking about it, it often begins by gaining attention. If we're thinking about a young child in a crib, how do they get parents to come to them, or how do they try to make their environment better? They may cry out, and then we've all went in there and tried to play the guessing game. Oh, they've already ate, so it must not be that they're hungry. I just changed their diaper. They must not be wet. Maybe there's something else going on. So a child might begin to know, oh, if I engage in this noise, then somebody will come in and try to make my environment better. And some children may demonstrate a limited range of motivators, or what we may think of as atypical motivators. We may have kids that, you're like, why in the world does he like shoestrings? Or why in the world does he only like beads? Or why does he like that videotape, but he doesn't like DVDs? Or we may see kids that only like specific things. But as you think about it, a lot of our kids may develop a love of something, and then without those social skills, they spend a lot of time kind of working on that motivator, talking about that motivator, engaging with that thing that's motivating to them. So it becomes that one thing they know a lot about. And we also have to understand when we're thinking about this that motivation and motivators change constantly. You know, when I was a teacher or when I was a therapist working with individuals, I would always be like, I know what's going to make this child, engage in specific behaviors. He loves Reese's Pieces. He loves trains. He loves cars. But I would also have to find other things that were motivating to them, because if they before they came to me, they had eaten a whole bag of Reese's Pieces, or they had watched a whole video of trains, then that might not be reinforcing to them at that moment. So I have to try to find things that are motivating to them and try to find multiple things that are motivating to them so I can then use those as reinforcers. So you might be thinking, why is motivation important? And when we're thinking about it, motivation is essential for understanding. It might be challenging sometimes because often individuals with autism have restricted repertoires of interest, and it may look like it's difficult to maintain that motivation. So it's very, very important that we're constantly trying to find out, okay, what are you motivated for today? As I work in homes and work with families and work in school systems, one of the major things that I always talk to them about is, what is their motivator today? What is their motivation to get this done? And sometimes teachers or parents will say, well, I know he likes stickers. Should I pull them out? Or I know yesterday he was really, really into the train. And I'm always saying, we have to figure this out daily. Sometimes we have to figure this out in the moment of what is going to be the thing that motivates you to engage in this behavior or complete this task or transition with me to the car to then go to the dentist. We have to find those things that are motivating to them in the moment, because we can't just make that assumption. If my boss came in and gave me a whole box of chocolates, but I had ate, two chocolate Pop Tarts for breakfast, then I might be like, this is not really motivating today, even though he may know I like chocolate. So that's why we have to constantly be thinking about what are those motivators? What can I use today? And so an individual's motivation, when we're thinking about what it's influenced by, is it's influenced by their learning history. For some people, high fives might be the thing that gets them motivated. You clean up your room, I give you a high five, I say, great job, Alex, on cleaning up your room. And so then it's paired with my learning history that I know that a high five is going to lead to a different reward, or that a high five is something that I should strive towards. And also motivation is based upon expectations of success. That we all have different expectations for success. Sometimes going into school systems or going into homes, we say clean up your entire room, when maybe that's a behavior that the kid can't engage in right now, or we say complete this entire piece of paper. And so thinking about what can be successful. Should we start in small steps, like just clean up your part of this part of the room, or just complete these 10 problems and then you'll contact reinforcement? So thinking about that as well. And also the environment. Motivation is influenced by the environment, whether it's a rich environment where a lot of reinforcement occurs, or whether it's environment that we have to do and there's not a lot of reinforcement. And, so what can be reinforcing to me might change in different environments. So we have to think about that when we're thinking about motivation. So when we're thinking about motivation, we have to think about what steps we can take when we're trying to find what's motivating to students or children that we're working with, or in a professional realm, those clients that we're working with. And the first thing that I always walk in and talk about is, how do you determine reinforcers? How are you trying to understand what is reinforcing to that child in the moment? And I often tell people, observe them. When I was a teacher, you know, with my individuals who are non-vocal, I couldn't walk up and say, what's going to motivate you today? What's going to have you more successful throughout the day? And they couldn't tell me that verbally. Sometimes they could tell me receptively with some cards or pictures, but I always try to observe them in the natural environment. You may see a kid go over and start turning over some bubbles. You may see an individual go and play in some water. And so we have to find out, like, the reinforcing item. What is going to make you engage in that behavior that we would like to see. And we also have to determine the skill level of each individual. I talked about this a little bit on the other side, but sometimes the expectations may be too high and the reinforcement's not at that level. Like we say when we're in the home with a student, or the child, we say, hey, I need you to pick up everything on the floor, when it's difficult for that individual to just pick one thing up off the floor. So we have to think about what is a successful step that we can then reinforce and then increase the amount of demands that we put on that child in the home or that child in the classroom. And then we have to look at what are those things that happen before a behavior that evoke challenging behavior. And the reason that that is so important is because when we're looking at reinforcement and motivation and changing behavior for individuals with autism, we really have to think about what are those things that are going to make you tick, make you then start to engage in that behavior that is inappropriate or challenging. And then once we determine that, we can look at how can we reinforce some behaviors before they engage in that challenging behaviors. So we really have to look at those steps while we're looking at motivation and reinforcement. So we've talked a lot about motivation. We've talked a little bit about reinforcers. So what specifically is reinforcement? And let's take a look at that. So the working definition is a stimulus change that immediately follows a response that increases the future frequency of any type of that type of behavior in similar conditions. So let's talk through that a little bit. Really, reinforcement is something that follows a behavior that increases the frequency that that behavior will happen more often, correct? So if I'm working with my child at home and we're working on homework, and I give them a sticker and then they start to do the work again and I give them another sticker and they complete another problem. Well, as I'm looking at that and I go, hey, let me just take a little data in my head. Every time I give him a sticker, that makes him more likely to complete a homework problem. Then I know that stickers are reinforcing because it increases the chance that he'll engage in that behavior again. Now, also, we can see this because we can also see that, every time he screams, I walk over and give him some reinforcement by engaging with him and saying, don't do that, don't do that. Well, that may also be reinforcing a behavior and making it more likely to occur. But with reinforcement, what we're going to focus on a lot today is what we call positive reinforcement. And that is when a response is followed immediately by the presentation of a stimulus, and as a result, similar responses occur more frequently. So let's think through that as well. So when a response or behavior is followed immediately by the presentation of something. So if we think back to what I said before, when the child was engaging with homework and I gave them a sticker, and that increased the likelihood that they would then do more of their work, that was positive reinforcement. It was followed immediately by the presentation of something that made responses more likely to occur. And that's what we want to look at, because we really want to take a look at how we can use reinforcement in the home and in schools and in professional environments, anywhere the child is at, to make it more likely that they'll engage in the behaviors we would like to see. Reinforcement is the most important and widely applied principle of behavior analysis, and it is the fundamental building block for those learned behaviors, those behaviors we want to see. And the theory states that reinforced behavior will be repeated, and behavior that is not reinforced is less likely to be repeated. So as we're thinking about our children, or we're thinking about the individuals that we work with in schools or other settings, we think about, okay, I want to increase behaviors I want to see. I want to increase doing their homework, cleaning up the room, brushing their teeth, completing a work sample, completing a task. So really, when we're thinking about reinforcement, we want to use positive reinforcement to increase those behaviors we would like to see, to make them more likely to happen in the future. And that way, when we're thinking about those behaviors we don't want to see or inappropriate behaviors, if we're using reinforcement for those behaviors we want to see, then we're less likely to see individuals engage in those behaviors we don't want to see. So thinking about an example of positive reinforcement. So we have Johnny. He eats his peas at dinner. And every time he eats his peas, his mother gives him a gummy bear. The next time Johnny has peas on his plate, he eats all of his peas because peas were paired with obviously a reinforcer, and that reinforcer was a gummy bear. So it makes it more likely that he'll eat his peas because he contacted a gummy bear, which is a reinforcer because it made the behavior of eating peas more likely to happen. So when we're thinking about that reinforcement, we're thinking about positive reinforcement. If we have determined reinforcers, the next step is what we call pairing yourself with reinforcement. And this is one of the things that I talk to a lot of parents, a lot of professionals, a lot of teachers about doing. And what that really means is you want to be seen as the giver of all things good. For example, when I used to do some in-home therapy, sometimes I would arrive at the door and the kids would be like, no, gosh, not you again. And so I started to think about, okay, that child was engaging with a video game or they were engaging with a movie. And when I get there, I would start immediately to work on goals and, things with this individual. Well, the child saw me as, man, every time she gets here, the movie goes off. She indicates to me a worsening set of events. So why would I want to be around her? And I had to learn that as a teacher as well. What I started to do as a teacher, as a professional, and I talked to parents as well about doing, is thinking about how you can pair yourself with reinforcement. If your child or your student can get reinforcement freely and they don't see it as coming through you for it, then they're like, why do I need that individual, correct? So I always tell them, think about being the giver of all things good. And what that means is my first, when I first started teaching, I would determine what was reinforcing to kids by looking at surveys and other things, and then I'd have it available. For example, I had a child that I worked with who loved dinosaurs. So I went out and had little bitty figurines of dinosaurs. So the first time he ever come over to me or was in my vicinity, I just handed him a dinosaur. And without placing any demands, without going over and using a big elaborate um, thing like, hey, I'm glad you're here today. Nice to see you. All I did was handing freely a dinosaur. And so I kind of was walking around the room later that day and he came over to me and put his hand out. He wanted another dinosaur. So immediately I'd paired myself with that reinforcer. If I had just laid those things out sporadically and he didn't have to come through me to get it, then why would he ever need to approach me? But I wanted to be seen as that giver of all things good. I also would do this on the playground with the individuals I was working with, whether it was a client or whether I was a teacher. I'm out there pushing them on the swing, not away from them. I want them to see that when that swing goes high, she's the person that's making the swing go high. I want her to be near me. And when you're paired with reinforcement, then they feel like they are seeing that all good things come through you. So I want to be around you. I want to be in your vicinity. So thinking about some ways that we compare ourselves with reinforcement, initially you want to, like I said, kind of hand out those reinforcers for free. You know, um, Now I'm not saying give them a whole bag of Skittles, but when you first meet someone or when you're working with your child at home, say for example, and you want to work on a targeted skill, but you don't want to just go in and immediately try to focus in on that skill, make sure the kid knows, hey, mom not only places demands on me, but she hands out reinforcement as well. In a classroom, my first couple of days, especially for my individuals who are non-vocal, I would just walk over and hand them those things that they liked. And you could see them gradually kind of stepping towards me like, oh, I want to be around her because I can hold out my hand and then she gives me my reinforcement. And so thinking about how you can hand out those reinforcers for free and then you're paired with that reinforcement. Also, I like to say avoid using that go play as a reinforcer for their responding. I know that we can't be around our kids 24/7, or we can't, this sounds like a utopian environment. Well, I have to cook dinner, or I, have to get um, the next lesson prepared. But thinking about initially, the play is with you. One of my students loved to build blocks. So I, had a little container of blocks beside me, and I would just gradually hand him those blocks. Well, then the next time he wanted to go play blocks, he pulled my hand over to the block area and wanted to engage with me with the blocks. So thinking about how you can kind of initially and throughout the time kind of be the person that they play with, that reinforcer comes through you. And you also, as you move on and kind of try to fade yourself, you want to put things on high shelves. So say, for example, you have a student who loves Thomas the Tank Engine, or a student who loves Minecraft, and there's activities that they can access, but you just don't want to put them out on the shelf. You want them to see that, oh, it's back there behind Miss Ferguson's desk, and I need to go approach her, and then she hands over the reinforcement when I ask for it. Or as a parent, those things are not always freely accessible, and that they have to come through you to kind of contact that reinforcement. And that can then that way you can be paired with those items that are reinforcing, and they don't have free access to it, but they see you as a giver of all things good. So now that we kind of have talked over reinforcement and motivation, um, how else can we determine what is reinforcing to a child or a student or a client that we may be working with? And we're going to go through a few, but locating those motivators, one of the things you can do is preference assessments. And I'm going to talk quickly through just one of those. I do want to say there are multiple preference assessments out there, but one that I use I'm going to go through. And then I talked a little bit about this, but observing the child in the natural environment. You may not see that they love water play. I was working with a little kiddo, really trying hard to determine what is something that I can use to motivate him to transition throughout the environment. What are those things that I can use to get him to complete a task in the home setting? And one day I saw him playing in the sink, and I was like, there we go. So I brought out a bucket of water, and I didn't fill it all the way up so that we weren't working on throwing the water out, but put it on the table. And so he would play with the items, and then I kind of scooted the bucket away, put an A and B in front of him and go, put the A in the bucket. And he threw the A in the bucket, and I moved the water over. He started playing with it again. So when you observe that child in that natural environment, you may find those reinforcers that you wouldn't always think of. Those items that, oh, by a survey, I didn't know that he played in the sink, or by a survey, I didn't know that he loved Play-Doh or Cool Whip, or those type of items that might not always be available or thought about by those people filling out those surveys. And that leads me to the last one, is using reinforcer surveys, trying to find out, okay, as parents, if you have the ability to kind of watch them in that natural environment, but if you work with individuals outside of home, you might not know that, hey, he loves to sit under a big cover, he loves to kind of rewind videos, he loves other things that they may have in the home that we may not be aware of in other environments. So I'm going to go over one of the ways that you can kind of determine those reinforcers. And parents, professionals, teachers can do this. Anyone can kind of run this. And I always recommend that teachers run these in the classroom to immediately assess what is reinforcing to that student before you go into instruction. But I've also recommended this in homes as well with parents. When you're sitting down with your child to kind of work on homework or kind of work on a task, if you can immediately determine what's going to be reinforcing to them, then you have a reinforcer to reinforce that work that they have to engage in. And minute by minute that, hey, I know what I can reinforce and make that behavior more likely to happen. And so the reason it is so important that we use preference assessment is it's often difficult for individuals on the autism spectrum to effectively communicate preferences, whether they might be nonverbal, or we might have students who have trouble with those open-ended questions. When we walk up and we say, hey, Jeffrey, what would you like today? He may repeat, what would you like today? And so they might not be readily available to have that conversation as your child or as your client or student to tell you, hey, this is what I would like to work towards. This is what I would like to do when I'm finished engaging in this activity or this task. And so that makes it important that we allow them to indicate their preferences whenever possible. And the best way is through preference assessments. And we're going to go over one of those today. But it's important to remember that preferences like reinforcers can change with age, options, and satiation. And with satiation, that is if they have something over and over again. Sometimes we find that one thing that really, really works and we make it available to them all the time. Well, if it's available all the time to them, it may decrease the effectiveness. So we want to make sure that we're trying to determine different types of reinforcers and options all the time. And research has shown that increasing choice-making opportunities is associated with increases in appropriate behavior and decreases in inappropriate behavior. A lot of our kiddos, I often talk about how they may not have a lot of choices throughout their day, especially our kids who have trouble communicating. Their clothes may be picked out. Breakfast, we might just know this is what they like for breakfast. And then they may go to therapy or school or appointments, and we're like, this is the way we go. This is where you're going to sit. This is how it's going to be. And so it's very, very important to think about how we can try to find reinforcement, and then we can use that in their choice making opportunities as well. Would you like to sit on the blue seat or the red seat? Would you like to play here or there? And we can give them opportunities to make those choices. So the first preference assessment we're going to look at is multiple stimulus without removal. And I promise you, the title is long, but it's very, very easy to run, and it's really, really quick to use to try to determine what is reinforcing in that moment. And so these are the directions of how you would implement this procedure. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to get an array of items. And if you're going to use a data sheet or if you're going to run it in the moment, you want to label those things on a sheet. I always put them on a tray. I like the backs of kind of Tupperware containers because they have those edges where stuff doesn't fall off as well. But you're going to lay those items in a straight line, and they usually recommend 6 to 7 items. So these items that you're using are things that they have engaged with in the past or things that they have shown interest in, and you're going to lay them out. Now, people often ask, well, what if they like computer or what if they like iPad? Those things can't be laid out on a tray with other items. They're too big. That's where you could use pictures in that case. And if you're using food items, you can put a little bit of that. For example, if you're using a granola bar to see if that's something they're interested in at the moment, you could put a little piece of the granola bar and you let them taste it to know, hey, that's something I might want to have at the moment, or when I'm finished with this activity or this transition or whatever we're going to do. So as those items are laid out on the tray, you're going to say pick one. Immediately after the selection, you remove the remainder items so that they don't pick again. And then if you're using your little sheet to see what they like, you put a 1 by that item to indicate they selected that item first. Then the key here is people always say, how do I get it away? How, if they like that item, how am I now going to get it away? Because right now we're just trying to determine what's reinforcing. And so I always say, be really quick and use a targeted statement like my turn, you take it away, and then you represent the remainder of the items really, really quickly, so that they don't have that latency is not there, so that they have time to engage in problem behavior. So you do not replace that item that they selected, and then you see there will be one less item. So then if you have 7, there will be 6. If you had 5, there will be 4. And then you say pick one again and see what they pick. And the great thing about this is this shows you multiple things that may be reinforcing to the student, to your child, to your client. And this can tell you a lot of things that you can use in the moment. The great thing is I then tell teachers and professionals and parents to then get into the activity that you were going to do. So say, for example, you were then going to do homework, or you were then going to do um, um, a task, or you were then going to engage in a functional task as brushing your teeth or doing something like that. Then you go immediately into the activity. And this looks like it goes really slow, but it goes really, really fast. And the great thing is you can then, once they've determined what they like the best, you can move it over here. Then you can go into whatever you were working on. Or you could say, all right, let's clean this area of our room, and then we're going to contact the reinforcer. Or now we're going to use, we're going to finish these 5 problems, and then we get the reinforcer that they selected. The great thing about that in-moment preference assessment is there's no question about what they're reinforced by. Now, if you put 5 or 6 things on the tray and they pick nothing, then you're thinking about, oh, I don't know what's reinforcing to them in the minute. And that's the thing that you might have to look at. I might need to observe them in their natural environment. I might need to really talk. If they're available to tell you what they like, then that's much easier than running a preference assessment. But, trying to engage with them about those things that are really reinforcing. And the great thing about this is we often assume, he loved Reese's Cups yesterday, that's what I'm going to use. She loved Barbie dolls yesterday, that's what I'm going to use. But if we think back to the definition of reinforcement, positive reinforcement is when they're presented with something after a behavior and it makes the behavior more likely to happen. So if we just assume and bring out Barbies today and be like, clean up your room and you get Barbies, and they don't clean up their room, maybe we don't have an effective reinforcer. So it's always great to try to determine what we can use to then increase those behaviors that we would like to see. This is a sample data sheet for multiple stimulus without removal. As you can see, if you're using it in a classroom or a clinical place that you work with individuals. And if anybody would like this sheet, I'm happy to send it out. So my email address will be at the end, but you write the child's name, who's using it, what the date that you're going to do, and then you list the items up here that you're going to use as a preference assessment. Then you write down the order of items that they selected it in. The great thing about this is if you use number 1 and then they really liked number 2 as well, you can present them with another choice as they're working, or you can present the other item so they don't get satiated on one item. So it gives you a look at multiple items that may be reinforcing to increase appropriate behaviors. The other thing that we said when we listed how we can find out what an individual is reinforced by, if you're working with them in a clinical setting or it's a classroom, is I always say send this home to parents, to guardians, to people that work with them outside of the school system. Parents, this may be something that if you want to go ahead and send this into the school. There are different types of reinforcement surveys, but this is a little chunk of one that I use. And it's something that kind of indicates everything that the child is reinforced by. So you check use a check mark to indicate what they like, um, and it just kind of gives an insight into those things that may be reinforcing to this child in another environment that they might not be aware of. And the great thing is, as reinforcement assessments go on, it also may be advantageous for them to also know what um, can be a trigger for your students. So if they don't like loud noises, if they need to have a schedule to understand what is expected of them, that's something that also may be effective to put on the reinforcer survey. All right. So when we're developing reinforcement schedules in the community, home, or classroom, we really have to think about those schedules and how they're going to look. And when we're thinking about how we're going to schedule that reinforcement, and when we say schedules of reinforcement, that is how often is our child or our student or a client going to contact a reinforcer. When we're teaching a new skill, and this is a skill that's not in their repertoire, we really need to have reinforcement available a lot, so, and when we're thinking about reinforcement, again, remember, it's dependent upon each child, each student. A high five can be reinforcing to a student. um, uh, Saying great job can be reinforcing to a student, or you can have kids or students that a skittle, or a piece of a puzzle. I often talk to people about using those reinforcement schedules looking like token systems, which we'll look at in a minute. But with those continuous schedules, that means every response contacts the reinforcers. So for example, if you're teaching your child to learn to pull up their pants, and they don't have those skills in their repertoire yet, and you're looking at it maybe as a task analysis, kind of breaking down those skills. You want to look at, like, I'm teaching a new skill. They're going to contact reinforcement heavily. And then as they are mastering the skill, I'm going to kind of reduce that reinforcement. If they then learn how to pull up their pants, then they contact reinforcement for pulling up their pants and putting on their shirt. Or in the classroom, if they don't know how to write the letter A, I'm going to heavily reinforce it at first, and then as they learn it, reinforcement's going to fade out. So we want to make sure when we're teaching a new skill in the home, we're teaching a new skill in the classroom or the clinical setting that we're at, working with individuals with autism, that when we're teaching a new skill, that their responses are on a continuous reinforcement schedule, which means those new skills being taught are contacting reinforcement at a very high rate. Then as they start to learn the skill, we may move to a fixed schedule, meaning after every third response, they contact reinforcement, and then gradually moving to a variable ratio schedule, meaning, after about every fifth response or around every sixth response, they contact a reinforcement. Because as we think about it as adults, we're on a reinforcement schedule of, getting paid every 2 weeks or every month, whatever our schedule is. And we want those reinforcement schedules of the children, the teenagers, the adults we're working with to start to look like a reinforcement schedule that they'll come in contact with in their working lives. So when we're first teaching a skill, we use that continuous reinforcement to reinforce the behavior. Then we move and gradually fade out to a schedule of reinforcement that will look like, I don't have to tell you a good job after you do everything. I don't have to give you a skittle every time you walk to the car. Now it's walking to the car and putting on your seatbelt. Now it's walking to the car, putting on your seatbelt, and sitting appropriately for 3 minutes. So we're thinking about gradually fading out the reinforcement schedules to make it look more natural. And when we're thinking about schedules of reinforcement, there are some things to consider. And one of the things we have to think about is if demands are too difficult or something that is not in the child's current repertoire, meaning something that they don't already have the skill of, you may find that response requirement may weaken motivation. And just think about this, if somebody came into me and said, hey, I need you to work out this engineering problem, and if you do it, I'll give you a chocolate cookie. Well, that engineering problem is not my background. So I may have difficulty, maneuvering through these phases of working out that problem, and chocolate is not going to get me to do it because it's not something in my repertoire. So we really have to think about, if a chocolate cookie is reinforcing, but we're making the skill or the requirement way too difficult, then it may weaken that motivation for that thing that we've determined is motivating to the student or our child. So, for example, jumping on a trampoline may be fun, but requiring me as a student or as a child to sit and comply with a ton of demands may be too high and may weaken jumping as a reinforcer. And so as a teacher, as a parent, as a professional, think about the number of demands we may place before we even think about reinforcing the individuals we work with. For example, we may say, hey, it's dinner time, come and sit down, go get your plate, come and sit at the table, let's be quiet, let's all, put our hands on the table. We've already got into 6 or 7 demands, and then they're required to sit even longer for dinner. So think about, response requirement may weaken that. So that's when we look at, if you have trouble with a math sheet, I'm not going to give you 25 problems to begin with. I may have you complete 3, and then we'll gradually fade up the number of problems. If you have trouble cleaning your room, I'm not going to say clean your entire room when I get back in 10 minutes. It may be, let's pick up your books first and then reinforcing you. So to make those demands successful, so they can contact reinforcement, and then gradually fading the amount of demand or type of demand that the child may have to engage in. So I always use this as an example. If someone offered me $500 to run a mile, I may try to run that mile even though I'm not a runner. But if they came back and changed the requirement and told me now it's 25 miles for $500, I would be like, oh, that's too difficult. It was going to be hard for me on the mile. Now 25 miles is out of the question. $500 is not worth it. So that reinforcement change, that demand changes the value of the reinforcer. All right. And also, we want to make sure on those schedules of reinforcement and looking at reinforcement that there are a lot of studies out there that have demonstrated that we need to reinforce behaviors immediately. So for example, if we're at home and we're working with our child, and this was the first time he put things in the hamper, we don't want to then 25 minutes later go, I love the way you put things in the hamper, because they're not making that connection that behavior contacted a reinforcer. So we want to make sure that the behavior they engage in immediately contacts a reinforcer. When I was a teacher in a classroom, I had a little purse that I wore all the time. Excuse me. And so I could immediately reach into my purse and pull out a reinforcer, and it was available, because if I had a child who sat for the first time for 2 minutes, or if I had a child in their home who picked up their dishes, I could immediately reinforce them. So thinking about the likelihood that if you're working with your child or your student or your client, having that reinforcement available, because we want to immediately reinforce those behaviors we want to see. So how can we give choices and determine what is reinforcing at the moment? Let's take a look at that. Now, we talked about looking at preference assessments, but once we kind of have determined some preferences, one great way to look at giving children choices and letting them know that they can select their reinforcers is using what we call choice boards. And when we're thinking about choice boards, we're going to think about how do we implement them, and what are those prerequisite skills that they need. So for example, if we're going to use a choice board, these choices might be written, so the child needs to be able to read those words. They may be able to, they need to identify those pictures if we're going to use pictures of those preferred choices. So if you're thinking about using a choice board in the home or in the school setting or in a clinical setting, the first thing you want to do is select an opportunity during the day when a student or child can make those choices, when you're okay with those choices being made. Then you're going to create visual representations of the available choices. So you can actually take pictures of them. You could do drawings. You could do those actual objects if you have students who can't make that picture connection. or you can use icons, or you could use words for that matter if you have a reader. And I often like to laminate those and kind of cut them out and put them on a board. Or I go on Google Images, make images of those on a piece of paper, kind of laminate the paper, and then have my student or child have a dry erase marker, and they can circle the choice that they want. And also, if there's something on there that's not available, I use a Post-it note to put over that choice, so that they know that that's not available. For example, if I had M&Ms on there, but there are no M&Ms in the house or in the building, then I put a Post-it note on there and let them select from the other reinforcers. Then the third step you're going to do is you're going to present these visuals to the child and allow him or her time to point or pick up the desired object or item, however you're presenting it. Then once they select one, you acknowledge the child's choice by verbally labeling it, like you picked blocks, or you selected, time on the iPad. And the reason you want to verbally acknowledge what they did is with kids, we want to pair the word with the item that they're engaging with. So if we have a student who's learning and developing communication, we want them to hear blocks, and then they play with blocks, so we compare that word with what they're doing. Then you give the child the chosen item and allow him or her to have that time with, get the item for himself or herself. So a choice board kind of lets them make that choice throughout the day or at a specific time in the day. These are some types of choice boards you may see. You can have pictures of items. You can have actual pictures of items. These are two that we used in a gym and then outdoors for students and children to make choices. You can use actual pictures. This was something that we used for Play-Doh, iPad, cookies. What would you like at this time? And they can make a choice. Or if you have kids who love specific movies, and want to pick like 20 movies, for one kid, we had them select movies by selecting the picture of the movie that they wanted at that time. The great thing about choice boards is it allows the student or the child the opportunity to say exactly what they want and make choice from other choices and know that choices are available to them. The other way that we can kind of look at reinforcement, and we see this sometimes, is in using token systems. And token systems is a behavior change system that is comprised of 3 components. The first component that you see is a specified list of target behaviors. So, for example, if you want your child to remain seated during dinner time and then keep their hands to themselves, that's the target behaviors you're going to target with the token system. Or if you want your student to remain in their chair and be quiet during instruction, those are the 2 target behaviors. But the student or child is aware of those target behaviors that are going to allow them to contact a token. So then what you do, tokens or points are something that participants receive for emitting the target behaviors. So if you're working on staying in their seat, when they're staying on their seat for a specific amount of time that y'all determine, they contact a token. And then you have a menu of backup reinforcers that they can select. So if you go back to the little choice board, you could have a choice board paired with a token system. And you could say, hey, this is your choice. What would you like to work for? Then you have to make them aware of the target behaviors. And again, you don't want to have too many target behaviors for a token system. You don't want to have to make a child remain in their seat, be quiet, feet on the floor, hands to themselves. We want to make this positive. And, so you might want to think about, as a teacher or parent, what is the behavior that impedes our daily life right now that I want to change? So if it's remaining in your seat, let's use this this token system to increase the opportunity for them to sit in their seat and reinforce that behavior. And then once they receive all the tokens, they get to then have the item that they chose. So whether it's Play-Doh, iPad, etc. Now, this can be a simple little token system. Again, we see that there are 10 tokens they have to get to get their item. Now, we don't want to start with 10 We may start with 2, then we may gradually fade it to 4, then we may gradually fade it to 5. And we can look at gradually fading this 2 ways. They could contact a reinforcer after, 3 minutes sitting, 3 minutes sitting, 3 minutes sitting, and then we could say now they get it after 4 minutes sitting, after 5 minutes sitting, or we're working on completing their homework. If they complete 2 problems, they get a token. Then you can gradually fade it. Now it's 4 problems. Now it's 5. So you can increase what it takes to contact a token as well. You can use tokens in all different ways. Here's some examples. If this student liked Angry Birds, so we used Angry Birds as little tokens, and then he would select from a backup menu. You could use stars, and this was one that's already created by a company. You could use actual pennies. Again, you want to make sure if you use these manipulatives that the students or child will not put them in their mouth. Or you can use stars that are laminated pieces of paper. So when you're implementing it, dependent upon the school level or skill level of the learner that you're working with, general steps include you want to describe how the system works. So tell them how they're going to contact a reinforcer. Now, depending upon the skill level of your child or student will determine how long you're going to describe this, how many words you're going to use to describe the system. You're going to model the procedure for them, so model how they will get a token, and then model the delivery of a token exchange so they know when they get the backup reinforcer. First token should be given on a thin schedule of reinforcement. So thinking back to that continuous schedule, remember how when we teach new behaviors, we want those behaviors to contact reinforcement heavily. This is what we want to start as well. And thinking of an example, you start with 1 token required to contact reinforcement, then gradually fading in the amount of tokens before reinforcement is contacted. You want them to receive reinforcement more quickly when you first start out as well. So that kind of leads us, I know we're getting close to our 12 o'clock ending time, but I just wanted to have a slide for those reminders that we kind of talked throughout today. Remember, when you're thinking about reinforcement and using that throughout the day, the first thing you want to think about is determine those reinforcers that are motivating for the child. Remember that each child has different motivation. Each child comes with their own learning history. You want to pair yourself with those reinforcers. You want them to see as good things come through me. You want to remember to gradually fade that reinforcement to look like a schedule of reinforcement that they will see throughout their entire, lives and work systems and things like that. Allow the child to make choices of preferred items, and remember, it cannot be called a reinforcer unless we look at its effect it has on a child's behavior. So just a few reminders as we're thinking about reinforcement. So now I just wanted to take a few questions. And as I'm taking questions, I'll put my information up here as well. So if you have questions but you don't want to ask it in the group, feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Email's the easiest time to get a hold of me because I'm out of the office, but I'm happy to answer any questions after the webinar as well. So I'll wait just a few minutes to answer any questions. Okay, the first question is, how is this different than bribing our child? When I tell people about this, teachers, etc., they say, isn't this just bribing them to do what they're supposed to do? And the one thing I'll say about it is different from bribing. And when we're looking at a bribing situation, that is, hey, if you sit in your seat, you'll get a reinforcer. What you want to set up with this is you want the behavior to contact the reinforcement. So if a child sits in their seat, they contact a reinforcer. So you want a reinforcement goes on the behavior. And when you're bribing a student, that you're using those types of scenarios of, hey, if you do this, I'll give you this. If you don't get off the floor, I'm going to do this. What you want to see is that natural progression of when they engage in a behavior, they contact a reinforcer. And this is the same that happens in every classroom throughout the school. You know, if you go into a general education classroom or you go into any other setting, if a student raises their hand, a teacher says, I like the way you're raising your hand. That's a natural progression of reinforcement. The teacher is reinforcing a student for engaging in a behavior, and that's how they differ. I hope that makes sense. Thank you. Okay, if there are any more questions. Okay, I think there's one more. Okay. At what age can you expect to start moving these kids away from requiring a reinforcer? I think that ultimately we should always think about reinforcement in the natural environment, but I always talk about how we can use to a more natural type of reinforcement. With students, for example, early on, a lot of times with children and students, you know, people will say, well, the only thing I can use as a reinforcer is food. And people say, well, we can't use food. I don't want to always use food. And what I start to do is pair more the naturalistic reinforcers that people use out in the environment with reinforcement. So, for example, if I'm using Skittles, then I might say, I love the way you stayed in your seat as I'm giving them a Skittle. So then maybe I can pair the praise with the actual tangible reinforcer. And that makes it more likely a natural progression to look at those reinforcers other people in the environment will use. So I really don't look at a specific age, but I try to start moving in those natural reinforcers as quickly as possible as well. I hope that answers your question. Okay, we have another one. When student begins learning a new behavior, does the student get reinforcement with prompting or only when task is done correctly without help? Um, that depends on the prompting system that you're using. With a lot of prompting systems, so for example, if you're using system of least prompts and you put a prompt in place, when they do it with a prompt, they still contact a reinforcer. But that it usually depends on what prompting system you're using to determine that, because different prompt systems may say in a program that you may be running might not require that. But usually when I'm first teaching and I have to prompt or I'm using airless teaching, I allow the student to contact a reinforcer because I want to teach them what I would like them to engage in. And so I use a reinforcement to reinforce that behavior even though it is prompted. I hope that answered your questions as well. Okay, we have another one. My son is addicted to his tablet, cell phone, etc. It has just become a habit to let him play on it. He doesn't just play games, he watches YouTube on learning things. He teaches me every day on stuff. I do not know. So how do I change this and take away something that he's just used to having as an everyday thing? I think that what you might attempt to do is especially in the home, I think it's easier in school systems because we're on a schedule to kind of schedule out that day. One thing that I have done to kind of try to teach to eliminate tablet time and cell phone time is I've made kind of what I called activity schedules at home. And I've went out and used like go to the dollar store and get a little photo album, for example, real cheap one. And so I'll put things in there. So I took a picture with one of the individuals I was working on, and it was a picture of outdoor chalk, you know, and so the picture of outdoor chalk was out there. And so we played with that, and I set a timer. And then the next picture in there was tablet. And then we did that for a couple of days. And then I added sidewalk chalk and a puzzle. And then the third picture was a tablet. And so what I did was I made an activity schedule for home, and it taught him new things to play with. Because I think some of our children and students, they don't know how to engage with other things, and they really tablets what I prefer, so I always engage with this. So teaching them other things to play with and how to play with it. And what naturally happened was then the individual I was working with would come home and just start doing other things, so that now he learned to kind of engage with other activities and items in the environment. And so we kind of gradually faded that tablet away, and then he would get it after 5 5 or 6 things later on. But then one day we just kind of held the activity schedule back and saw that he came home and started to play with something else. And then we're like, that was our whole goal. So kind of trying to move those things in might be a way to teach him to play with other items in his environment. Hope that helps. Okay. That is the end of our hour. If you have any other questions or anything, okay, she there was a follow-up, so I want to respond to this. So how do I handle when I do try to limit it down? He throws a fit and screaming and yelling, sometimes in a public place. I would not try to eliminate it from a public place at this point until you teach those new skills. I would try to limit the time he has it like in a controlled environment where you can work on the tantrum. So maybe at home, try to limit it and use that activity schedule. And then we're not, then gradually trying to, as he learns that I'm going to get the iPad later, but I have to do these other things first, then you can look at it in the environment, such as a public place like the library or, the grocery store and things like that. So I would try to work on that in the home environment first, and then see if you can teach him to engage with other things, teach him that, oh, when the timer's on, I've got to do this, and then you can, as he learns that, then you can use it in like the grocery store. And you can set the timer and say, we'll get this after 5 minutes or so. You're welcome. All right. Well, that's the end of our time. And again, if you have any more questions, feel free. My email address is right there. I'm happy to answer them. Or you would like me to forward you anything, I'm happy to do that as well. Thank you guys so much for attending, and I hope that this helped you with learning about reinforcement. Thank you again.